Hello, everybody, and welcome to Raritan Power Tips Live. My name is Joel Bryan, coming to you live from wonderful state of New Jersey. We have some good weather finally here today. Um, and if you've joined us previously, you understand how we do this. We take you through a live demo of a function or feature, and then following that, we'll open it up for questions regarding this particular function and feature. And as always, if you have issues outside of the scope of what we're covering today, it's always best to email us at tech@raritan.com, or if you want to talk to a live person, certainly pick up the phone and give us a call. We'll be there to certainly help you and address those issues. And walking us through today's session will be Duncan Gwynn, who's part of our post-sales support team here at Legrand for the Raritan ServerTech brand. And today we're going to focus on using our mass configuration PDU deployment tool. You know, if you have hundreds of PDUs and we want to quickly spin those up, get those on the network, we have a really cool tool to do that for you. It takes you about 30 seconds using the tool versus anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes doing it manually, one at a time. So with that, I'm going to pass the ball over to Duncan, and Duncan is going to walk us through on how we use and configure our mass deployment tool. Okay, Duncan?
All right, thanks, Joel. And thank you all for joining us again. As Joel mentioned, we're going to cover our mass deployment tool that's used with a USB stick to configure Raritan PDUs. So the first step would be, where do we find the tool? So if you go to raritan.com/support, it will bring you to our product support dashboard. You'll see this yellow box here with some important technical advisories. A lot of good information here. So this is the portal where you're downloading firmware for all Raritan products. So we have a drop-down menu where you can select the product that you're after, but we also have a most viewed products section here. So we're looking at the PX3 iPDUs today. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And when you go into the menu for the product, it will automatically take you into the most recent firmware that we've released. So for the PX3, this is 3.6.0. And if you're running, older firmware, you can view support files for those individual firmwares down here. So under the tools and drivers section, you'll see that we have spreadsheet for firmware update and configuration mass deployment. So I'm going to go ahead and click that to download the tool for this particular firmware version. And it's important that you match the firmware version because, as things change in the firmware development, the tool kind of changes with it. So always try to match the firmware version. So with that downloaded, I'm going to pull up the spreadsheet. So you see you have to enable editing. One important thing here is that this worksheet uses Visual Basic macros. So in order for it to do what it does, you will have to have macro support. If you have security measures in place, we have some instructions down here to change security level if you have the privileges to do that. If not, we recommend, of course, getting permissions to do so, as this tool will save you time. The other important thing to note here is that when using the USB stick, it should be in the FAT32 format to function with the PDUs. So this first tab, tells us how to use the tool and gives us, a lot of details on best practices. But since we're doing this webinar, rather than read this whole page to you, we'll just jump into it. I'm going to hit Enable Content and jump over to the Settings tab. So in the Settings tab, you see at the very top, we have general settings of the PDU. Now, we're kind of operating under the assumption that you've just installed these PDUs, they're on the factory default settings, and you're looking to configure the network for the first time. That being said, it automatically populates with the default admin account and admin password for the PDU, which is admin and Raritan. If you've already changed the default password, we recommend obviously updating this so that everything authenticates properly. The unit identification criteria is what this tool and the USB stick is going to use to identify what unit gets what IP address and name and any other device specific settings. So you see this is a drop-down menu. It also has the ability to be done via MAC address, and that was the way we did it in previous firmware versions where the units only had a single MAC address. But with our newer iX7 controllers, we have 2 Ethernet ports, 2 MAC addresses. So it's easier for us to identify it based on serial number. And then this column here is set to 3. We'll look at that in a moment, but that's also variable if you want to adjust the device list sheet that we'll look at shortly. So jumping down to the next section, we have firmware upgrade. So you can also use this to upgrade your PDUs as you're configuring them. If maybe you've had them installed for some time and you're just now getting them configured and you need to upgrade to the latest firmware. If you want to do that, you can check this box and then you can browse to a firmware image. Now I've already downloaded a firmware image from our support page for the latest version. So I'm just gonna click open. And what this will do is make sure that the file name matches in our USB stick configuration, and we'll also transfer that file from where I had it saved to my target directory that I'm going to select. So I'll leave that for now. The force update, if same version is already installed, I'm going to leave that unchecked, but if you wanted to, you could check that box, and if it read the firmware version that was currently on the unit and it matched, it would still go ahead and write a fresh firmware version over it. With it unchecked, it's going to see that it's already on 3.6.0, and it's going to skip the firmware upgrade stage and go ahead and run to the configuration. As we continue down, we have user settings. Now, the only user setting that we have here is the admin password. Now, this is important for our latest firmware version, 3.6.0, because due to California Senate Bill 327, we are now required to force a password change before the PDU can be used for security purposes. So if you get the PDU on the network and you log in, you'll see that it'll ask you to change it before you can do anything. Same with SSH. And if you try to do a USB stick configuration, it will do the same thing. So somehow I got muted. Hopefully I wasn't muted for very long. So we can now put in our new admin password, and obviously this must be different from our previous password. So I'm just going to add 123 on there. And if we go down to the network interface portion, we have the interface speed here. So we've set this to auto negotiate, but these are variable. We can force them to be whichever speed we want. And then if we want it to be full duplex or half duplex, we can select that as well. I'm going to leave these both at auto. And continuing down, we see our internet protocol configuration. So we're going to use IPv4, but we do have IPv6 support as well if you wanted to use that. If you wanted to use DHCP, you could check this box and then select your preferred host name and set up your DNS servers as well. But we're going to go ahead and use a static configuration. It's one of the beauties of this tool is to be able to assign every device a unique IP address. So in this stage, this is where the tool starts to look a little bit different. So you see IPv4 address, and then in that field we have $, curly bracket 4, curly bracket. What this is doing is telling this tool and the PDU, when we generate these files, it's telling it to look at column 4 of our devices tab. So as mentioned, we're matching the serial number in column 3. So when the USB stick gets inserted into the PDU, it's going to scan the files, and it's going to look at the serial number of the PDU and match it in this CSV file and say, okay, I'm this serial number, I get this IP address that's in column 4. And then you'll see that the gateway here is column 5. So it will then put in the gateway for column 5. So, we can modify this tool as needed, and scan in our serial numbers. If you have them installed in the cabinets, you can just kind of go down the row and scan them with a simple barcode scanner into the spreadsheet, and then, define your IP addresses, and then it kind of makes it a mindless task. You just go through and insert the USB sticks, and everything gets set up exactly how you have it defined in the spreadsheet. So the other thing here is the prefix length. So this is our subnet mask. We use a CIDR notation. So this would be a /24 subnet, 255.255.255.0. If you need it to be larger, you can of course change this to a /22 or 20 or whatever you're using in your network. And then, your DNS servers can be configured here as well. I'm going to leave those blank for now. Our next section is network services. So we can enable and disable certain services here. And, Telnet's disabled by default, but if we, say that it was enabled by checking this box or unchecking it, it will then change the configuration to disable that particular service. So I'm going to leave these for now. Forcing HTTPS, that's going to redirect any HTTP traffic back to the secure port, HTTPS. And then SNMP, maybe I want to load these into PowerIQ or another SNMP manager of some kind. So I want to go ahead and define my community strings now. So I'm going to check that box to make sure SNMP is enabled, and I can plug in my community strings here in these 2 lines and update them as needed, of course. And the remaining, if you have SNMP v3, you can set up those settings here as well for the admin user. And then your MIB2 system group syscontact stuff there if you want to use that. Date and time settings. This is important, especially if you're using an external system to monitor these like PowerIQ that require some NTP synchronization there. You can check that box and plug in your NTP server addresses here. Or you can use the manually specified time and set up your time zone. Just going to leave this unchecked for now because I don't have an NTP server to plug in there. And device settings. So here is where you would define the PDU name. So this is the name that you see when you log into the PDU in the web UI at the very top of the screen. We have just an example here, but most of you would have some sort of naming convention for your PDUs. So we just have an example px-row. And you'll see the column 1 here, $ column 1, -rack column 2. So it's going to read this as px row 1 -rack 1. And we can see that here for this particular row 1 rack 1. And then with the PDU that's ending in 02, it's going to name it row 1 rack 2. As it goes down the line, it's going to, of course, modify the name of the PDU and the IP address and every device specific parameter here, as long as it correlates with the same row as the serial number. And this multi-master linking box here is unchecked currently. I'm going to leave it unchecked. We'll cover this in a later session, but this is for a new PDU linking feature that's available in 3.6.0. It is a nice feature to have in the tool because it kind of simplifies the setup of the PDU linking if you're deploying that at a large scale. I'm going to leave it unchecked for now. We'll cover that later. And then the last option here is Freeform Data. So as you may notice that there are many more features to the PDU that are not readily available in this tool. But if you have some parameters that you wish to configure that aren't in the tool, you can check this box and then add what we call a config key to help you with those settings. So maybe you want to add LDAP authentication settings or some other settings that you want to include on that bulk configuration. That can just be added in the sheet here, and it will make sure it's in the config.txt file that we're going to generate. So with all of our information filled out, I'm now going to go up here and I'm going to select a directory. Now this defaults to the temp directory. I'm actually going to put it on a USB stick here. And once I hit the export lists, the macros run and it generates the necessary files that I need to perform this configuration. So I'm going to pull up that folder here. And just a moment. So you'll see the files that it's given us here. We have our config.txt file. We have a devices.csv. We have a devices_piq.csv. We have fwupdate.cfg. And lastly, we have our firmware file that we selected. So that's the 3.6 firmware image. So the first thing that I want to look at here is the fwupdate.cfg. So this is the first file that the PDU looks at, and it has the username and password. So it authenticates, and we can ensure that we have access to make these changes essentially. It will generate a log file. So if there's any problems in the configuration process, it's going to throw in a log on the USB stick for us so we can easily view it back on our machine. This is the config file that we're referencing. So this file has to be on the USB stick already, which we have. And then we see our devices file. So this is devices file, basically that same device list that we saw, just kind of stripped down with no headers or anything. We're not really using that column, but you can see all the other datas here: serial number, IP address, gateway, and then our row numbers and our rack numbers. And when we look at let me pull the firmware update file back up again. Firmware equals, so this is the firmware image that we wish to update to. So that has to match exactly. We are not forcing the firmware update in this case. Now, if we wanted to, we would set this to true. And then our match. So we're matching the serial number that's in column 3 of that devices tab, devices.csv sheet. And then lastly, again, this is new to 3.6, the set_password equals, and we're setting a new admin password for this PDU. So that's all that line's doing. We can modify this to be whatever admin password we want. So we looked at the devices sheet already. That's pretty much what we already defined in the tool. But now if we look at the config.txt file, we see a bunch of lines here that are gonna change the configuration on the PDU for us. So we see our network interface is enabled with 1. Our speed and duplex settings are both auto. Wireless LAN's disabled. The bridge interface is disabled. We're using IPv4. We're using a static configuration method. And our IP address will be found in column 4 of that devices sheet. Our subnet mask is a /24. And then our gateway will be found in column 5 of the sheet. Now, if you're using the same gateway for all your PDUs, you can hard code this and put in the IP address of your gateway right here. You don't have to reference that sheet. But if you are in a situation where maybe you're making one configuration file for multiple sites, or you have different areas of the data center that have different gateways, you could of course modify that and use the sheet. We're not using IPv6, so that's a 0. This network migration line goes back to an older firmware version when we changed the network stack, when we added the dual Ethernet ports. So that line has to stay just to ensure that we've done the proper upgrades and that migration has been done. When we look at these lines here, these are the network services. So we see that we're doing that HTTP redirect. We've disabled telnet with the 0 there. SSH is enabled. And then our SSH port is 22. So that's the default port. You could modify that if you wanted. SNMP agent is enabled. We're using version 1 and 2C. And then our community strings are down here. We're not using v3. If we were using v3, you would see a lot more settings here that would be included in the configuration file. And then lastly, we see the PDU.name equals the name that we've defined in the tool. And it's going to reference column 1 and column 2 based on those serial numbers. So that is the configuration tool in a nutshell. Now there are some other methods available. You can use the USB stick for the raw configuration, the bulk configuration. We're not covering those today, but if you have questions about those, you can always shoot us an email at tech@raritan.com. If you need any help with the tool, you can send us an email or give us a call. At this point, I'm going to push it back over to Joel, and we'll open it up for questions. Joel?
Okay, great. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you. That was really good and really informative. I'm going to take everybody off of mute. If you do have questions that you'd like to ask, now is the opportunity to ask those questions regarding this feature. I would also like to ask to make sure your device itself is not on mute. So I'll unmute you, but you got to make sure that your device is also unmuted. If you want to ask any questions related to the bulk configuration tool. Okay. Let's see if we have any questions typed out. You could also type your question if you don't want to ask live.
Hey, Joel, one thing that I forgot to mention, if we don't have any questions yet, is, of course, once you have those files loaded on a USB stick and you plug them into the USB-A port of the PDU, you will see something very similar to this. The screen will show a green smiley face if the configuration was successful. And if for any reason there's an issue with the configuration file or something didn't go right, you will see a red screen with a frowning face, and in which case you would check that log file and see what went wrong on the configuration. But all right, now
Okay.
questions.
Yeah. So that's after you've loaded the file onto the USB stick, and now you're ready to plug that into the USB port of the PDU. You would see that smiley face if everything was done correctly.
That's correct. Yep.
Good. Sorry if it's a little noisy behind me. My neighbor decided to start cutting his lawn.
Yeah, no worries. I do see a question that just popped up. So someone has asked, is there a way to do this without the USB drive? So we do have a method that it's a bit more complex. It uses DHCP and TFTP, and it's essentially the same process, but that TFTP server becomes the USB stick in that situation, where it will read those files that we've generated and do the same thing. Now, if you wanted to load a configuration remotely onto a PDU, we have some methods to do that as well that are in our help documentation. Most of this is done through SCP, so secure copy. You can put a raw configuration or a bulk configuration template onto a PDU, but at that point it would already need to be on the network. So you would have done at least some basic configuration there. But yeah, beyond that, the method to do this without a USB stick is the DHCP TFTP method, which is also in the help documentation.
Okay, great. Yep, very good question as well. Sure. Doesn't look like we have any other questions being typed in, unless there's anybody that wants to raise their hand. Do we have something else?
Hold on, I think there might be another one. My screen's really small though. Are your firmware updates compatible with PX2, or are they per version level? So, our PX products, with the exception of our PX1, they're on the same platform. So the PX2 and PX3 actually use the same firmware file. You'll see, I use the quote unquote PX3 tool, but my firmware file still says PDU-PX2. So if you were to download that firmware image from the support site in either the PX2 or the PX3 page, it's going to be the same file. The only differences would be, obviously, the controller is a little bit different on the PX2. So our help documentation's slightly different. That's why there's two separate support pages for the two different products, because there are slight variations, but the firmware is the same. I see some other ones. Is this faster than using a scripting tool? Yeah, in a lot of ways, yes. I mean, if you are, a scripting wizard, you might be able to do this faster, but for those of us that aren't, it's easier to just generate these files on a USB stick and then go and plug them into the PDU. And within, if you're doing a firmware update, it takes a little bit longer. It might take, 1 minute and 30 seconds to 2 minutes. But if you're just doing a configuration, it's done in a matter of seconds, and you can move on to the next. So if you're out in the field, you can load these same files on 5, 10 USB sticks and just go down the line and do it really, really quickly.
Yep. Good point. You mentioned config taking 30 seconds, but past experience of when a firmware upgrade is done, the config will take 5 to 6 minutes per PDU. Has something changed?
And he just said, he just answered my question. So yeah, again, if you're updating the firmware, it'll take longer, especially on those older PX2s that were running like 3.2 and you're upgrading to 3.3.10. There was quite a few changes between those two firmware versions. So that one was a bit longer. That time has gone down, but it just depends on the firmware version and the product, I suppose. So most of the time it's going to be pretty quick in the 1 to 2 minute range. But again, if you're running an older version, it might take longer.
Okay. Doesn't seem that we have more questions coming in. If nothing comes up, I want to say thank you everybody for joining. This session is recorded. We will have a link sent out and posted by the end of the week, so that if there's others in your organization that you think would benefit from this, please feel free to share that. If you have STI products, we have a live STI session tomorrow. That's going to be hosted by Jim Shear, and we're going to go through similar configuration process for their mass deployment tool as well. Again, thank you again for joining. We're going to do this again in about another 3 or 4 weeks. And if you have topics and suggestions that we could discuss, please feel free to send them to this meeting request. I'll get that email. Okay? So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.